Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak at today's um, The Future of Programs and Quality Assurance event. Um, I know you're head of education with CORU, and you're going to speak today about a set of guidelines on placements that CORU published in response to providers' requests for clarity and further expansion on CORU's requirements for the conduct of placements during the pandemic. So could you tell us a little bit about CORU, first of all, and then maybe a little about the consultation and development process?
Perfect. Thanks very much, Mairead. So CORU, as you say, is Ireland's Health and Social Care Profession Regulator. It was established under the Health and Social Care Professions Act, so it has a statutory remit. So we currently have 17 designated professions, and we have registers open for 11 of those professions, ranging from radiography, medical scientists, right through to social workers, and we will be opening a register for social care workers as well. So quite a breadth of professions. Each profession has a registration board, and that board is responsible for setting the standards for entry to its register. So it has, I suppose, a statutory function to approve, monitor education and training programs for graduates' entry onto its registers. So I suppose it was in that context that we, I suppose, would have been engaged very heavily with our education providers in March 2020, I suppose, at the outset of this pandemic. And obviously, the impact of the closure of the institutes and some of the practice placement sites at that time. And obviously, that has implications for graduates achieving the standards required to practice safely. Our remit is very much around public protection, and those standards are absolutely required for the graduate to be able to come onto a register and to be able to safely practice in their profession. So we would have engaged with the education providers at that time who were, I suppose, adapting to the changes required, whether that was a move to online learning and obviously adapting methodologies in terms of how practice placements were being provided. So each of the education providers who would have had a program that was approved across the breadth of professions would have provided information to their registration board about the changes that they were making to their programs to assure that their graduates were able to attain those standards of proficiency and that they would be safe to come on to a register and to practice as future professionals in health and social care. And I suppose it was arising through that communication in throughout 2020 with our education providers that I suppose we wanted to examine not just the immediate impact on the graduates of 2020, but what were some of the longer term impacts in terms of the students who were on those programs and who would have been, I suppose, going out in practice placement or whose placements might have been impacted. So we commissioned a piece of research. We had an independent researcher who came in to work, I suppose, with the executive in identifying a range of different stakeholders to interview as part of that process. So we very much targeted education providers themselves, those education providers who are implementing the changes to their programs across the breadth of professions that we regulate, as well as the practice placement providers. So where the practice placements, whether they're in hospitals or in private settings or in volunteer community settings, and as well as the professional bodies representing the different professions and other key stakeholders who were involved at that time around, I suppose, what was happening within higher education institutes, but also around the education and training of the future health and social care professions. So that independent research we would have written, I think, to over 26 institutes and asked them to identify someone appropriate to be interviewed. Those interviews were conducted by phone. Obviously, at the time, I think we had re-entered restrictions at that stage. And the providers provided a lot of, I suppose, really valuable information, not just, I suppose, about the challenges that they were currently experiencing in terms of, I suppose, the online learning, in terms of the, I suppose, the how quickly they had to change and adapt to facilitate students' attainment of the standards of proficiency, particularly where they may have lost certain practice placement sites. They had to source new placement sites to facilitate the students being able to achieve those standards. So that research gave us not just a really good insight into the challenges, but also, I suppose, the I suppose the flexibility and the adaptability of the education providers themselves to creatively identify how they were adapting their programs to meet, I suppose, that new environment in which everyone was operating at the time. And it was from that research that we commissioned that the education providers themselves would have highlighted that they would benefit from additional guidance from CORU. We had very much communicated throughout 2020 within our criteria for education training program, within our standards, there's flexibility, I suppose, for education providers to determine how best they meet those standards. And the flexibility, I suppose, is around how they know their local context best, they know their practice placement providers best, they know the challenges they're experiencing best, and they know the curriculum design, how it delivers on the standard of proficiency, and what changes to that curriculum design might impact on the achievement of the standards. So while that had been communicated, I think the providers themselves felt it would be helpful to have more information around some of the different methodologies that were used by providers themselves in adapting practice placements to ensure that the students were able to attain those standards. So that's really where the guidelines, I suppose, arose through that engagement and that piece of research we conducted.
Thanks a million, Catherine. I suppose what really struck us in QQI was the clarity of the guidelines that you provided and the structure, the really helpful structure looking at prior to placement, during placement, after placement. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and why you decided on that structure? And I suppose any other features of the guidelines that you'd like to talk about, that'd be really great.
Thanks, Maureen. The clarity of the structure took a long time to get to, I will be honest. Because of the breadth of the professions that we regulate, the different professions, I suppose, have different standards, and how those standards are achieved and the impact on the placements was very different across the different professions. Some of the students were never not in practice placement, and for some, the practice placements were very much restricted during that period. So I suppose when we approached this, we very much approached it from what had education providers already told us they have been doing, but we also, I suppose, had connections with a breadth of our national and international regulatory colleagues. And all of those were undergoing similar issues across the world at the time. And we had, I suppose, access to that shared learning, but also access to the breadth of standards and guidelines and information that have been issued not just from regulators, but by a breadth of other bodies as well to education and training providers on how to facilitate students during the pandemic and how to ensure the students still achieve the required standards. So it was taking all of that information and it was trying to break that down into a generic methodology or example that could be relevant to our different professions. And when I say could be relevant, not all of the examples we had given would necessarily translate for every single profession, but it was trying to give an example of some of the things that we had heard from providers that they were doing. And that naturally broke down into pre-placement, what were the activities that they were doing to support students to prepare for them going on placement, particularly where they may be going into sites where there was a greater risk around maybe contraction of COVID, and there might be requirements or guidelines and training that they would have to undertake in advance of the practice placement. Things like using PPE, some of this is quite new for some of the professions in the sites they were going to be going into. So that naturally broke down into pre-placement requirements, pre-placement activities, that the student would be required to undertake in order to be prepared to either to go on site. Some of our students would still have been on site throughout the pandemic, but also then where there were other methodologies being adapted. So for example, the involvement maybe of a student in a virtual and telehealth, maybe in case conferences, their involvement in, I suppose, assessment maybe of kind of a particular need, or some of them would have run groups. And again, very much to link to the proficiency that they had to achieve. You know, how did the methodology that was adopted to facilitate the practice placement and the achievement of the practice placement hours, how did that actually support the student to attain that proficiency so that you knew at the point of graduation that they would be safe to practice? And again, I suppose that the following the practice placement itself, how did the student and how were they supported to integrate that learning? I think it was new for all of our health and social care professions. I think everyone was adapting very, very rapidly and very quickly to a very changed context. So part of what the student was learning through the practice placement itself is actually what the health and social care professions who are out there practicing were learning. That shift to telehealth, that shift to, I suppose, online engagement with service users you might not have had before. I suppose that rapidly changing context in terms of contact tracing, in terms of PPE, all of the different requirements. So it naturally broke down into those types of activities. But we were very clear, I suppose, when we issued it to providers, Mairead, this was not intended to be directive. We really do recognise that the providers themselves are best placed to make those decisions. And this was just to provide some additional information that the provider themselves could determine whether or not that methodology would work for their students and their students' achievement of the standard of proficiency. So the guidance, as I said, I think has been well received from providers. I think obviously it was 2021 when this was issued, it was 12 months in, and there had been a huge amount of learning that had already been adopted and taken on board within the institutes themselves. So much of this, of what we provided, was actually coming from the innovations that the education providers had already put in place. I was just trying to capture that information.
Thanks so much for that, Catherine. And I suppose, I mean, another thing that struck QQI when looking at these guidelines is obviously they're specifically, they're aimed at a point in time. So they were aimed at placements during COVID, but there's a lot that we could take from those guidelines to look at, at in terms of their development. So the very broad consultation in terms of the structure and in terms of the clarity and the general applicability across a range of different programs and professions. And it's certainly something that we'd love to explore further. Just finally, I know you'd mentioned that CORU had conducted some secondary research in relation to practice placements. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I suppose at the end of 2021, we commissioned a literature review, so some research to kind of examine. Since 2020, there has been a huge wealth I suppose, of academic papers and a huge amount of research conducted and a huge amount of information issued. So we wanted to collate that, and we commissioned a researcher to undertake that literature review, looking at specifically, I suppose, at information relevant to health and social care professions and impact on practice placement, but looking not just in Ireland, looking to Canada, Australia, the UK, to, I suppose, examine, I suppose, what had been the challenges experienced across jurisdictions, what were the innovations that had been adopted, and what were the opportunities then in going forward for I suppose, the delivery of practice placements and quality practice placements that continue to provide opportunity for students to achieve the required standards to practice safely. So the literature itself is very much, I suppose, reflective of what's already happened within the Irish jurisdiction. So it was quite interesting to see that what has been adopted by the Irish higher education institutes is actually very common across what has happened in Canada and Australia and the UK as well. So in some ways, it's comforting to know that our colleagues in other jurisdictions grappled with these issues as well, but also, I suppose, confirmed that the Irish education system really, I suppose, it adapted very well during very challenging times to ensure that the standard and quality of the education training programs continued, and that students and graduates coming from those programs would continue to meet a standard to practice safely.
Perfect. Catherine, thank you so much for outlining the development process of the placement guidance, and for telling us a little bit about its structure and some of the follow-up on their development. We really, really appreciate your contribution to this event.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.